My name is Madeline Hassler, and my presentation is on flaws in the certification of the Boeing 737 MAX aircraft. During this presentation, we will be covering two Boeing 737 MAX crashes that occurred, the certification process of the 737 MAX, maneuvering characteristics augmentation system, which is a flight control system that was installed on the 737 MAX aircraft. We will also examine the lack of redundant systems, adequate crew alert systems on the 737 MAX, as well as a lack of pilot training. We will go over the settlement and deferred prosecution agreement that resulted from this case, as well as some biblical integrations. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 crashes 12 minutes after takeoff. All 189 passengers on board perished. Just 132 days later, on March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed 6 minutes after takeoff, killing all 157 on board. Following these two incidents, the FAA grounded all 737 MAX aircraft. The Boeing 737 MAX aircraft would remain grounded for approximately 20 months. In 2011, Boeing set out to create the 737 MAX under an amended type certificate of the 737NG. The FAA is the authority responsible for certifying a new type aircraft. The certification process involves a review of the proposed design, ensures the design complies with FAA regulations, evaluates ground and flight tests. Additionally, an evaluation of the aircraft's required maintenance and operational suitability will be conducted. In collaboration with other aviation authorities will occur to ensure the aircraft will be approved for import. In 2009, Organization Designation Authorizations, or ODAs, were created by the FAA to assist in certification of new aircraft. These teams follow rules and regulations set forth in federal laws, then submit the certification to the FAA. The FAA or the EASA, which is the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, are the only authorities that can issue an airworthiness certificate. Within the ODA program, Boeing has the Boeing Aviation Safety Oversight Office. In the case of the 737 MAX aircraft, 87% of certification plans were delegated to Boeing, with only 13% under FAA employees. The amended type certificate typically takes between 3 to 5 years as opposed to 5 to 8 years for a new certificate. Additionally, the amended type certificate would allow the current 737NG pilots to require less training, which we will go further into later in this presentation. As we learned from our textbook, throughout the course, the FAA was created with a purpose in mind. That purpose was to promote safe flight of aircraft. 49 U.S.C. 44701 is a law that gives the FAA authority to create rules and regulations within the aviation industry. Within that law, the FAA is responsible for promoting safe flight of civil aircraft in air commerce by prescribing certain standards. They are also responsible for laws surrounding the certifying of new aircraft. Following the investigation of the two 737 crashes, it was concluded that these crashes were due in part to the self-inspection program giving Boeing too much discretion when approving critical safety work. The FAA did not properly understand changes between the 737NG and the 737 MAX and did not supervise the Boeing ODA team adequately throughout the certification of the 737 MAX. Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, commonly referred to as MCAS, was a major change in the 737 MAX. The 737 MAX had larger engines that were placed further forward on the airplane's fuselage that resulted in a pitching up nose attitude. MCAS was designed to work in the background to combat the nose pitching up in certain situations. However, MCAS operated off only one angle of attack sensor. What this meant was that if a sensor was damaged, MCAS could pitch the nose down just off one sensor. In the case of the two crashes, it was found that one of the angle attack sensors was damaged, so MCAS was using information for just one single sensor. MCAS's authority was greater than the FAA was originally told. In the original design, it had 0.55 degrees of authority and would only operate at higher airspeeds. The final version of MCAS, which was finalized only a year before the airplane was certified, had an increased authority of 2.5 degrees and could function at lower speeds. This was a revision that was never passed along to the FAA. Boeing retested MCAS for response to uncommanded inputs. Testing assumed pilots would react to the uncommanded input within 4 seconds and that the pilot would treat it as a runaway stabilizer. Boeing determined if no action was taken within 10 seconds, the results would be catastrophic. MCAS was never mentioned in pilot training manuals. At some point during the certification process, Boeing requested to remove any mention of MCAS in the manuals, and the FAA representative approved it. The FAA claimed they were unaware of the final revision and authority of MCAS and were under the impression it was only allowed to activate at higher airspeeds. During the investigations, it was determined that some members of the FAA flight team were aware of the final revision of MCAS and its authority. This fact shows us the lack of communication between the FAA and Boeing throughout the entire certification of the 737 MAX. The 737 MAX, like many other aircraft, comes with certain options airlines can purchase for an additional cost. Two of these options that were not purchased by either of the airlines that crashed were an angle of attack indicator as well as a disagree light. The angle of attack indicator would have provided the pilots with the actual reading of the sensor, which may have warned them something was wrong. This also would have provided them with more information during the troubleshooting of the emergency. The disagree light would have illuminated if the two angle of attack sensors were reading differently. This would have provided the pilots with the knowledge that one or both sensors was not functioning properly. According to Title 14 CFR 25.1322, flight crew alerts must provide the crew with the information needed to identify abnormal operations or systems and determine the appropriate actions, if any. These indications also must be readily and easily detectable, even during times of multiple alerts. These two systems would have only cost the airlines $50,000 per aircraft. As an aviator who has had emergencies throughout my career, I would always like to have as much information at my disposal so I can make a more informed decision. Boeing and the FAA should have deemed these components critical to flight safety and not something that could be purchased for an additional cost, but something that came standard on every 737 MAX aircraft. Boeing designed the 737 MAX so that it could qualify for an amended type certificate and so that pilots would not require a new type rating. An email was found from a Boeing ex-engineer stating that Boeing would pay Southwest $1 million per airplane if the 737 MAX required simulator time for their pilots. This shows Boeing's dedication to requiring the minimal amount of training over the option that was safest. Training requirements for an amended type certificate are typically set between level A and level E, with A being the least and E being the most, including a full check flight in a simulator in addition to simulator hours. The 737 MAX pilots required level B training, which was slide presentations, computer instruction, stand-up lectures, or videotapes. The completion of this training would end in a task or system check. The training received included no material on the MCAS system. Video on changes in the 737 MAX, which allowed it to go back into service.
The airplane is finally going back into service. Really good news for Boeing. After all, this airplane makes up about 80% of the company's overall airplane orders, which are dwindling. So what has Boeing fixed on the airplane to allow it to get back into service and apparently be safe again? First, remember, pilots just simply could not trust the airplane's computer system. It was designed to notice when the plane was tilted too far nose up. The MCAS system, as it was called, forced the nose of the plane downward to try to stabilize the airplane. They did this because with the new MAX, the engines had to be shifted a little bit, possibly putting the plane more at risk of going nose up and stalling, which is the last thing a pilot wants. In the case of the deadly crashes, one of the sensors, or both, on the airplane, on the sides of the airplane that detected possible nose up, was broken. Maybe it was a bird strike or something. It just wasn't working. So now Boeing has required the system to check for both sensors, the left and the right, to make sure everything is safe before having the software fix the nose of the airplane. Secondly, Boeing has required the MCAS system to only try to correct the airplane one time as opposed to continually forcing it nose down. That was the issue with the crashes. The pilots were wrestling with the computer system until eventually, sadly, it's a bad visual, but the plane went down. The third fix on the airplane, that same sort of concept, when the airplane corrects itself back nose down slightly, the amount that it corrects has been reduced, so it's not as dramatic. There are a lot of MAX airplanes that Boeing has made, but not been able to fly to the airlines to deliver them, so they've just been sitting on basically every available parking spot Boeing has across the country. A source of mine at Boeing says it's going to take about 10 hours per airplane to implement the new wiring and software fixes on each individual MAX, so it could be a while before these planes all get delivered. Not to mention, some of these airlines, remember, have been crippled by the pandemic, so they can't even afford some of these airplanes. They've had to cut orders, and now there's going to be negotiations over who pays for the cost of storing these planes for the past 20 months.
Now, based on all the activities that we've undertaken during the past 20 months and my personal experience flying the aircraft, I can tell you now that I am 100% comfortable with my family flying on it.
Many feel with these new safety changes, the Boeing 737 MAX will be the safest airplane in the skies when it eventually starts hauling passengers again before the end of the year.
In January 2021, Boeing was charged with conspiracy to defraud the FAA and entered into a deferred prosecution agreement, commonly referred to as DPA. Boeing was required to pay $2.5 billion. This fine was split up into a criminal charge of $243.6 million, $1.77 billion, which went into compensation payments to the airline customers of the 737 MAX, as well as a $500 million crash victim beneficiary fund for the families of the victims of the two 737 MAX crashes. Boeing admitted to defrauding the FAA since they concealed safety issues of the airplane. As part of the DPA, some of the things that Boeing is required to do is implement new safety protocols, meet with the fraud section, report fraudulent activity, and cooperate with future investigations. After 3 years, if Boeing meets these stipulations, the criminal charges will be dropped and they will be immune from further prosecution regarding the 737 MAX lawsuit. During the trial, Boeing executives placed blame on 2 of their technical pilots that flew the 737 MAX. One of these pilots was sentenced to a criminal charge, but acquitted the same year. The technical pilots lied about their knowledge of MCAS, even all the way throughout the investigations of both 737 MAX crashes. Boeing executives need to look at the interests of their future passengers instead of personal interests. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Philippians 2:4. I chose this verse for the issues of the 737 MAX because I felt Boeing chose their company profits over human lives throughout the entire certification of the aircraft. Boeing should have never fought for an amended type certificate without ensuring the aircraft would be completely safe. Additionally, there is no reason pilots of the 737 MAX did not have better training before flying the aircraft. In today's world, so many of us are selfish, including myself at times, so we should fight to live through the Word of God and put others' needs before our own. Moving forward, the FAA should examine their ODA program and possibly add more FAA employees to ensure adequate oversight. If there had been more FAA oversight throughout the certification of the 737 MAX, it is possible they would have recognized the major changes within the MCAS system. The FAA should have never certified an aircraft that lacked redundant, safety-critical components and that had the authority to pitch the nose of the aircraft without the pilot's knowledge. The Boeing company should put safety over profits with all decisions they make. Boeing has over 10,000 airplanes in service across the world, carrying millions of passengers each year. As passengers and aircrew members, we should not have to worry about if the airplane we board or fly will be safe or not. Thank you for listening. are the references that I use throughout my presentation.